Hey everybody, Paul here, and today I wanted to talk with you a little bit about line quality and mapping of surfaces using illustrative techniques. Um, so the things I'm going to be talking about in this demo are going to be won't necessarily be only about illustrative stuff, but I'm going to be showing you illustrationally how line quality affects things. So and also how line quality can be used to show motion, movement, dimensionality, and volume and form. So let's go for it. So the base idea that I wanted to talk about was the main precept is that as we begin to draw stuff, we can do things where we have lines that have just sort of a no big change and no big difference in the lines. And there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing, depending on the type of imagery that you're coming upon, you're going to have lines that don't have very much variance to them. But that being said, lines that have a change in width and shape and kind of work with the flow of the direction that they're going in, will give you way more expressive stuff, and also will kind of do double duty for you in that they will give information about a form in addition to pushing you through a dimension. So if I'm showing you here, the lines that we are looking at here, in both of these, the directional shape that our eyes are moved in with this might in fact be kind of like this. Here, the lines that we're seeing are giving us information about like where the flow is, but in a little more intuitive and a little more interesting way that we see how this is pushing it through. So it may be a little bit more poetic, it might be a little bit more again, just have sort of flow to it that's more organic perhaps, and less mechanical. But all the things that I'm showing you are things that can apply to more mechanical, more vector-based, more engineered type things, as well as type flowing things like this. So let's go ahead and take a look at the pencils on this SIZER guide that we worked with last time. So as I'm taking a look at the portion of this head here, like if I was going to begin inking on this, part of what I'm going to be looking at is going to be where is the gravity, where's the weight of this form, and how do I want to have the lines that I'm going to be using to emphasize that for me, or to show it. The thick and thin that I'm talking about, I'm just working in Photoshop here, and I just have a brush that is set with the ability to respond with the Wacom tablet's pressure, so that the harder I'm pressing, I'm getting a thicker line. Lighter touch gives me a thinner line. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is just identify where the weight is, and I think what I'll actually just kind of do is let me start inking on this, and I'll kind of explain as I'm going along rather than talking about what I'm going to do. So let's go ahead. All right. So I'm following where my thick and thin is. Not making huge variances. So as we're looking at this, one of the things that I always talk about when I'm explaining to students kind of the placement of where I'm putting thick and thin lines is that you can get a little bit more action out of a few well-placed lines rather than a bunch of lines trying to do the same job. So as with kind of with most stuff, economy of motion, economy of line is always going to kind of be your best friend. But it gives more responsibility to those lines. You know, great power comes great responsibility. The fewer lines you are going to be using, it means that those lines need to really do what they need to do and do it well. So, but if we're thinking about this in terms of making of forms in design, that economy of motion or the economy of line is always going to be a major thing that you as a designer are always going to be thinking about. You're always going to be thinking about how can I do this, you know, in the fewest amount of lines? How can I do this with the fewest amounts, you know, an economical visual system? So again, this is that thing where the work and the information that you have as an artist informs how you think as a designer. So let's go ahead and just sort of finish it. And I apologize. This isn't going to be, this isn't necessarily the best inking work that I'm doing. I'm working on a Wacom tablet that's a little bit different than the one that I'm used to, so the surface is a little slippery, so my hand is not going to be quite as accomplished as it normally is. So forgive me if this isn't the best drawing work that you've seen come from me. Let's go ahead and move around here. So in that same way where I talked about having where my weight wants to be, like as we're going up here on the laurels on here, I'm also going to be doing things with what I'll call holding lines or contour lines. So a contour line generally ends up being something where you're putting a heavier line on the outer shape of something, and then using thinner lines on the interior to indicate kind of an interior divides, interior shapes, interior forms within that outside shape. So with these laurel leaves on this headdress here, I'm tending to do a little heavier of a line for that, and then when I go in and do any kind of interior shapes like the crease on the leaf or the vein on that leaf, that's a thinner line. Again, just trying to speed this up a little bit because watching me draw at real speed is kind of boring if you're not doing it. So yeah. So yeah, let's just go up here. So let's take a look. I'm also going fairly, kind of fairly quickly on this with, and not staying exactly necessarily being held to tracing these lines exactly. The idea behind when you're penciling with stuff is not to necessarily exactly trace. Those lines are meant to be fairly close to what I want to do, but I'm also making a lot of decisions about size of lines and where things are going to go on the fly in the inking stage here. So the hair, let's talk a little bit about this. With his hair, there's not really any need for me to draw every single strand of his hair. That would be virtually impossible to do. Again, what I'm looking to do is I'm looking for a few lines that can get across the idea. And this dovetails nicely into the ideas about mapping a surface. So if I have his hair up here and I'm showing it as he's got a little bit of like a cowlick where his hair would be flipping around, I don't need to draw every single line, but I can draw a couple of representative lines that get across the idea of that hair flipping up, of how it's moving on its own, when it's changing direction, where it's going. But again, I don't need to, I'm not trying to photographically recreate it. I'm giving you enough information so that your mind can kind of fill in the blanks. And as a designer or an illustrator, that's always going to be a part of your tricks. Is that what you're doing? Is that you're giving enough lines so that the person who's looking at its brain is going to go ahead and fill in the blanks, and our brains are really, really good at that. So as a knowledgeable person, you don't have to, again, be as absolutely pedantic or absolutely devoted to being 100% representational, because if you give enough information, the person who's going to looking at it is going to fill in the blanks. So you can count on that, and it allows you to try things, again, that economy of line. A few well-placed lines will get across more and more efficiently than thousands of badly placed lines. So, and that's something that you just are going to learn, and you'll just sort of see and get better at as you practice it. So just kind of wrap up around his ears here. So let's go ahead and go down here on the neck, and this is going to be, again, another option, and I'll move kind of quickly, but I'll talk while I'm doing it. This will be another instance where we're going to go ahead and use the thick and thin lines to indicate where the gravity on these folds of cloth are going to be. So as you're seeing me do this, I'm going to have thinner lines along the top, and then as I pull those lines on bottoms, those are going to be heavier lines where more weight is on those folds, and then as they move back to the top, they are going to thin out. So I have this, I'm working with a Wacom tablet, so I'm working with a pressure sensitive brush, and I learned how to ink and draw with analog tools. So I learned how to ink and to work with actually like a sable hairbrush and India ink. So the things that I learned about making this kind of weight and these kinds of line quality decisions is based on the fact that I learned how to do it analog. So I'm going to demand that my forms, that my tools that I'm doing using to digitally create stuff have to be able to do the same thing that I can do, or at least do as well as I can do analog. So once again, we've just got ideas of thick and thin, of that line quality. So yeah, let's go ahead and take the pencils away. Yeah, so we can see that, once again, as we kind of look at this from a kind of a post-mortem way of thinking about it, where are the heavy lines in this illustration? They're on contours, they are on the outsides of shapes, and they are on the low parts of the gravity of these individual shapes. And they help to establish where the weight, where the flow, where the flow of movement is coming from this clasp up here, and then as these lines cascade down around his neck, the thick lines are emphasizing kind of the most weighted areas, and the thin lines are emphasizing either interior shapes or kind of the high points or the high gravity lines. And it just gives it an overall flow to this. So one thing that I've kind of been hinting at and doing that I want to talk about a little bit more specifically is the idea of using lines like this to map a surface, or to using lines to emphasize a surface in a way that doesn't necessarily use shading and highlights and all that, but we're using kind of the same ideas of shading and highlights, but we're using kind of simple lines to do that. So let's go ahead and view up, kind of get over to the side here. I'm just going to kind of draw an amorphous shape, and I'm not going to give very much contour to the line, meaning I'm not going to make very much difference in the thick and thin of this line. So this is a relatively simple, kind of even form. So with this, by seeing, with us not having any real visual clues as to whether or not, what kind of volume exists in this shape, because I've got such an equal line around this form looks relatively flat. But in the same way, even if I'm just going to start giving small ideas around lines that are going to map along the surface or along the contours of this, I can give a bunch of information about this with very small things. Matter of fact, if I wanted to make this feel like this is a non-flat shape, look at how much action you can get out of this by, like, even if I show this, like, as soon as I put these kind of folds in it, these lines are giving me information about saying, oh, well, this is a point where this is bulging out here. This is where there's a crease in the surface. And even the small point of this line here is giving me information about, oh, well, now I'm thinking about this surface in a different way. I'm not seeing this as a flat line. I'm seeing this as something that is shaped, that has a volume, where there's bulges, where there's surfaces that are coming together and beginning to fold or beginning to go in and out and depress and to rise. And I think that that's one thing, again, speaking about the economy of line, you can get a lot of results from a few well-placed lines. So with this, the more that I place on here, I can, with lines or with indications of lines or portions of lines, I can show a ton of information about the surface of this. So, even if I kind of did that, kind of this stuff. So even the introduction of these lines, or if I'm looking at forms, if I'm looking at like shapes and forms that would be on here, like, I'm not even sure really what we're looking at here, but it's looking like some kind of amorphous weird eel or school bus or plane or whatever. But the idea behind this is that if I'm placing this shape on here, which if that was like, if it was flat, perhaps that's a rounded rectangle. But because I've kind of mapped the shape to and made it agree with these other lines, it looks like this flat rectangle here now is kind of mapped to that form. So in the same way, if I wanted to put a like a circle shape on here onto this format, I wouldn't do it as a flat circle. I would probably contour it as kind of an oval or oblique shape. So even if that was meant to be an actual circle, I've now mapped it to the surface of this, and now it's essentially agreeing with the contours that I'm applying with these other lines here. So as you begin to take a look at this, like let's say if this is, I don't know why I think this is turning into like a spaceship or something like that, or some kind of weird shoe, that I can show just by the contouring of these lines. I can imply the feel of that shape, and I can imply how that surface is warping. And I'm making the lines on here all agree with one another, and when they do, your brain is going to start assuming, oh, this surface is acting this way, this surface is acting this way in relationship to it. There's an edge here, so this is something where maybe we're seeing a little bit of a curvilinear portion of this, and then it changes direction when it comes here. So, as I'm I'm not making anything that is anything representational here. I'm just I'm laying shapes on this form. But from where we started off from with the flat form, this now is like has a ton of contour information in it. And even if we took it back to those the small lines that I was showing you here, that idea about that this line that I placed here is giving me a ton of information about the feel on this. This is giving me a ton of information about, like, oh, this portion here is has a curved linear face, and then when it gets to here, it changes direction. When it's getting to here, it changes direction. How this is, these lines are indicating or giving you information about how this section feels. This is giving you information about how this bulges out, or how it flows or changes direction when it gets to a fold, and that kind of stuff. And I think that that's, in that same way that we can take a look at that. And with the lines that I have here on the face, even though I'm not necessarily drawing them, I'm giving indication of saying this is a place where his face, where his jaw, his chin is changing direction from maybe the rest of his face here. So it may be an instance where he has kind of a smooth face here, but then this portion is indicating that there's a change in that plane of where it is. So again, that line is giving us a cue to musculature, to bone structure, to things that are underlaying. This crease here that's going from the edges of his nostrils is showing us the indication that there is the musculature and bone structure for the cheeks on there. But we don't have to draw this out. If I draw this out, it's going to be a cadaver. But in that same way, if I give enough information with these lines, I'm accounting for all of the volumetric things that are on here that my brain will put together. So again, the bulb of the nose. This line up here is indicating the fact that I'm having an arch. So his face goes here, and then it goes over the arch of the nose, and then continues. Roundness on the lids of the eyes. Bone structure here, where the nose, the bridge of the nose comes up here and meets with the skull. Indications of here of the furrow in his brow, the folds of eyelids, and where the weight of those eyelids are. So as you can see, as I'm like pedantically, adding all these shapes in, I'm making this like way more complicated than it needs to do. And again, it looks like I'm, kind of looking at a cadaver with all the individual things. That's why, when we talk about this, the idea is that a few well-placed lines kind of do all this work for you. So, as I'm looking here, it's like his neck goes here and then is responding to the tendons that are here, and then the way that his throat is wrapping around the windpipe, and then this tendon and the muscle groups that are in the rest of his neck. We're getting all this data that our brain is filling in the dates for, in the information for. Same thing, these curving lines here are giving us indications that his hair is going up and then turning back like this. So the more, we can show a lot with not very many lines, with not as many lines as need to happen. Same thing down here as we take a look at the way that the cascades of this, we are given indications of this being rolled fabric where it's rolling, and then when it gets to this crease that's being pulled by the gravity up here, that changes direction. It changes direction when it gets to that fold. It changes direction when it gets to that fold. So if I was to trace and like put a marker along the contour of those shapes, this is here, but we don't necessarily need to have that. Our brain puts that together. And so if we're connecting all these folds, they're all emanating from being kind of gathered at this clasp up here. But we give enough to indicate that our brain will fill in the dots, that it will say, well, this fold that starts here and that I see an indication of goes over here, and that this fold, this crease here, it continues on, but I don't have to show the entire thing. So I think that, when you begin to think about that, when you're drawing things as vector files, when you're drawing things as very simplified or abstract forms, this is the kind of thing that that kind of economy of line and that knowingness that you can get a lot accomplished with very little is going to be super helpful for you. And I think it's going to make things that are going to have a feel and have the idea behind them of having visual flow. So again, let's blow up here. So even if you're working with something very abstract, like if we're trying to translate the feel of a human body, like if we're trying to look at a human figure very abstractly with just representing it with lines, I can show kind of the body language. I can show the direction of movement. I can show the flow of motion with a very few amount of lines. So even if we have something like this, our brain will put it together. So if we're looking at this, we'll get the idea of like, well, I'm kind of seeing like, here's maybe shoulders, and here's the body, and here's maybe a leg that's extending out. But I'm just, again, picking my best, my best things, and seeing if I can get it accomplished with a few lines without having to, again, represent everything to show a complete idea. So if we're thinking about things like with like a dancer or a dancing form, the translation of this might be just a few very simple shapes that get across the idea of I'm looking at arms, I'm looking at muscle groups, I'm looking at hair, I'm looking at just general flow. I can do that with these lines, and these lines are doing double duty for me. They are giving me information about direction of flow. They are giving me information, about where things are placed, where the direction of motion is going to be. But they are also doing things like they are giving me information about contour. So again, if I have lines like this that are leading me in a direction, that may give me a volumetric feel about saying, well, this is indicating something that maybe is wrapping around an arm, or maybe is contouring around a torso of a body frame. That these lines here are indicating, a human head. That we're looking for, and we're seeing things, hair that's traveling off of it, but again giving us information about the line that is inferring the volume of the form of the head of the skull. Again, how much can you get away with as little as possible? And when you really think about it, and again, this is the connection that I've always made with being a designer but also being an illustrator, is that to me it's like cartooning is all about learning how to get across an idea with as little as possible. And I think that design, the more I study design, that the same is true with design, is that you want to get across complex ideas, you want to get across nuanced ideas, but that economy of the elements that you're using to show that is always going to make it a more successful, more clean thing. There's always going to be a room for excess and showing everything in the kitchen sink. But the opposite is also true. There's also a great elegance in being able to get things across with one or two lines, one or two really good lines doing the job of 100 lines that aren't very well thought out. So hopefully that kind of stuff gives you a little bit of information, a little bit of help with thinking about this, and that maybe this will give you some thoughts about how to translate this into forms that you're making in other programs, vector forms, pixel forms, shapes, abstract forms, representational things. All the stuff I've shown you kind of interconnects, so I hope that's helped you out. So thanks for stopping by and watching this video, and we'll draw again soon. All right? Thanks very much. Have a good one.